We're here, some might say we back, but we're ready to talk fantasy leagues. They're about to start. So I'm going to go through what I think are the best settings for your fantasy basketball league, and Michael Bolton agrees.
Thanks, Josh. It's Michael Bolton here, and it's time for another episode of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Let's get to it.
Let's get to it, indeed.
You are Locked On Fantasy, your daily NBA fantasy podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast, brought to you by Basketball Monster. My name is Josh Lloyd, and you see that shampoo bottle? I'm also the lead fantasy analyst at basketballmonster.com, and you can find me on Twitter as always, at redrock_bball, on TikTok at redrock_bball, and on Instagram at Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Make every moment more. In the summer, the sports are a little bit thin on the ground, but FanDuel's got something for you. Every day, every customer gets either a boost or a bonus. That is every day for every customer all summer long. Go to FanDuel.com right now to get started. Thank you also for making Locked On Fantasy Basketball your first listen every day. We are free and we're available on all platforms. Double bang it, thumb it up, leave your comments down below. So I do this video every year. Many of you would have seen it before, and that's okay. Obviously, I'm not just reposting the video, but most of the things that I talk about are exactly the same. Except for the fact that some of the ideas that get floated have been tested more. Some opinions may have changed, and you get to see those ideas that we discussed fleshed out. Or maybe you haven't watched that past video. Maybe you're a new fantasy basketball player, or maybe you're new to this channel. If you think you know everything about fantasy basketball setup, totally cool. You don't have to watch this. That's all good. You can let it play in the background. But what we are going to do is just go through a bunch of different things that I think make for a good to the best fantasy settings, the best experience. I'll explain why and why not. And I think that covers it all. As we go through and talk about that, let's get straight into it. Let's go to the basics. I'm not going to go completely basic and tell you how do you play fantasy basketball. That's not what we're about in this show. If people actually want that, maybe we will do it, but I don't think we will. So what are the different types of leagues that we're setting up? Well, I've got 5 broad categories here. There's head-to-head category leagues, which is the most popular format of the game. There is head-to-head points leagues, which is the second most popular format of the game. I believe the numbers are about 60 or 55 to 60% head-to-head categories, 35% points leagues. Then you have Rotisserie leagues, which are category-based leagues, which are about 5% of all leagues. And then there is a different thing. These last 2 points I'm going to mention, they are similar but different. There are draft-only leagues, which the guys over at Fantasy Basketball International, Kingy, B-Dub, Matt Lawson, that they run a bunch of draft-only leagues, meaning you draft a team, but you don't make any moves during the season. Now, you might say that's best ball. It's a little different to best ball because draft-only leagues that the FBI runs are category-based leagues, and they're not best ball. You still set lineups, so it's not draft-only in the sense of do a million of them and forget them. It's draft only that you can't do trades and waiver pickups. And the other one is best ball, which obviously is growing in popularity. But I think that best ball and season-long fantasy are actually quite a different thing. Best ball is obviously that format which you see so much there on Underdog and DraftKings. Unfortunately, I'm not allowed to participate in those leagues. But what best ball is you draft a team and the system automatically determines your best grouping of players for whatever time frame the game sets. Usually it's per week, and it's always points-based formats. And then you compete for large overall prize pools, not just individual leagues, and you get through certain stages. It is a very different situation. Even though it is played over an entire season, best ball fantasy is not season-long fantasy. It's a very different situation. So I don't cover as much best ball on this show as maybe some of you would like. I think a lot of the principles that I talk about and the valuations of players can carry across, but the ideas and the drafting strategies in best ball are quite different, and they're not really a season-long fantasy game. You invest an hour into it in August or September, and that's it, you're done. So while the game plays over a season, you don't. That's the difference. That's what best ball is. Draft only. You do a draft, and that's the only way of getting players, but you still can make moves to set your lineups during the season. And I think that's a pretty significant and notable difference. There are 3 major types of leagues. The majority of what we talk about here is applicable to all, but it is more focused on the first, which is redraft leagues. And what is a redraft league? It means that even though you might have the same managers every year, you might not. You redraft your team every single season. A keeper league is a league where there are determined rules where you can keep a certain amount of players. A dynasty league is a league where you have the ability to keep every player. A keeper league is not the same as dynasty. That might seem pedantic because I guess in theory a dynasty league is a keeper league. You just keep every player. But I think this is more for when you are asking questions, whether to me or other fantasy analysts or putting it in comments. If you say you're in a dynasty league and you say and then later on you say, well, we only keep 4 players, that's not a dynasty league. You need to be more specific so that we understand or people understand where you're coming from in your league. Keeper and dynasty, while they may seem the same, they are not. A league where you keep 2 players is basically a redraft league. A league where you keep 10 players out of 12 is getting closer to dynasty. And the differences in terms of how to evaluate players changes depending on whatever any sort of setting is that you have. The valuation of a player and how you view that league will change. So let's get into the basics of starting a league. The number one thing you've got to determine is how many teams are going to be in your league. We can have 6-team leagues and 8-team leagues and 10 and 12 and 14 and 16 and 20 and 30. To me, I think you just want to have 12 teams. I think that is the most straightforward way to go. Not only is it the default setting on Yahoo, which is the number one fantasy platform, it's the default setting, I believe, on Fantrax. ESPN's is 10. The shallower leagues you go, the more, I don't know what the right term is here. It just becomes a lot more churny. It becomes a lot more super teamy. And for some, that might be what you want. But I just think in general, the mix of 12 teams is the best for the best outcome. Now, you might say, well, I've only got 10 mates. Well, that's cool. Totally good. And we'll get to that, what that means practically later on. But ideally, it's like when I run all of the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl Leagues, we do 12 teams per league, per division. Because I think it's the best number. I think it gets the best results. The other decision you have to make is, will you have divisions in your league? Most of the time, it's not necessary. If you do go to a larger size league, a 20-team league, a 30-team league, maybe you do make divisions, and then you create all the matchups only in that division. But overall, having divisions in a fantasy league where then you have a certain rule where the winner of each division automatically qualifies for the playoffs is really unnecessary. I just don't think it's required in any sort of standard setting or even like a 14-teamer. There's no real reason for it. Again, unless you are going to keep all matchups within a division, then it makes more sense. Otherwise, no need, no sense, don't require it at all. The question that a lot of people love to ask is, what do I do about finishing my leagues? Well, don't finish just yet. We're going to get to it in a sec. Because today's episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. You need passion, drive, and patience to get to the answer of when to finish your leagues, which will come up soon. But you also know that is what builds a winning championship team. And with eBay Motors, you've got everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and to level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, LED headlights, brake pads probably. Spark plugs, are they still a thing? I don't know. Maybe it's fuel caps. Maybe it's flame emoji decals. Maybe it's baby on board stickers. I'm not sure, but eBay Motors has everything that you could want for your number one ride or die. Over 122 million parts for you to sift through and find the right thing that you need. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, you are guaranteed to get the part that fits your car every time. Get it right or your money back. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. Guaranteed Fit is only available to US customers. So, like I said, we're going to talk about when to finish. When do you end a league? The NBA league the NBA league dates basically the same as what they were last season, so my advice on this does not change. If you are in a head-to-head league, you should be finishing on March the 23rd. March the 23rd is the end, and again for clarity, please clip this out, save this. If you commission a head-to-head league, If you are in a head-to-head league, your league, the playoffs of your league, should end March 23rd. The reason we end March 23rd and not the actual end of the NBA season, which is April the 12th, is that the final 3 weeks of an NBA season are full of nonsense. Limited minutes for teams, for good teams. Limited minutes for bad teams. Fake injuries. And we've got a loaded draft class coming in. There will always be the one or two Jeremy Grants who are allergic to playing at any time during March. One or two. That'll always happen. You cannot legislate to avoid that. We can't say, well, we're just going to keep pushing it back further and further. I know that was a sentiment that happened this season a lot. Man, it's even worse. I don't think it was actually worse this season. There were a lot of injuries, and I think a large part of that was the 65-game minimum rule, which meant players had to play through things they shouldn't have earlier on. Fatigue caught up, and we got to problems. Irrespective. I think if you finish with 3 weeks to go, you are going to have some nonsense happen in head-to-head playoffs. That is just going to happen. But there's going to be injuries at any point in the season. We just focus significantly on the playoffs. I think the 3-week time frame is the right time frame. Finishing with 3 weeks to go in the regular season. If you push it further than that, you are inviting trouble. And there are going to be crazy people out there, that is you I'm talking to, who say, no, we played at the end of the regular season. That's the true test of fantasy skill. It's not. It really isn't. And I actually... If that is your opinion, that is fine. You are wrong. That is, but whatever. Trying to determine whether Justin Minaya is going to play 48 minutes a night and being the first to add him, it doesn't determine any of your skill of moves for 20 weeks or how you draft or anything like that. I'm also not one of those people who's going to tell you that, well, I was the top team for 20 weeks, therefore I deserve to win. Not how that works either. We all know of how leagues run, and the best team in the regular season does not always win the playoffs in any sport. They might, but if they do, what's the point of having playoffs? If you run a roto league, just go to the final day of the season. No problem with that. Go to the final end. If you're playing a best ball or a draft only league, I actually do think for a best ball or draft only, maybe move it back to March 17th, because again, in those leagues, you have zero ability to make any trades or waiver moves. And the more of the back end of the season that you cut out, the more you are rewarding, which these drafts are literally rewarding your drafting skill, then that is more reflected. So I would push that one actually a little bit earlier, because you don't have to worry about a bunch of different things. I don't think there's any point of pushing those any later. So head-to-head leagues, March 23rd. Playoffs end. Roto, April 12th. Best ball draft only, March 17th. That is how I would be setting that up. The other thing when you're setting up your league and your teams and all that sort of stuff is how many matchups do you have per week? Now, everyone will just say, obviously, it's one. And if you're playing on Yahoo or ESPN, you don't have any other option. But if you play on Fantrax, which you should, if you play on CBS, then you have the option to face off against multiple opponents each week. And that's what we did in Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl last year. And I think it was good, because what it does, the more matchups you have, the less randomness there is overall. Now, how many times have you heard that story? I got beaten this week in fantasy, but I had the second best team. I would have beaten every other team. All right, that happened to me 3 weeks in a row or whatever. You hear it all the time. And yes, I know that is the nature of a game. But we're in a situation where, like, if we can play a matchup against two opponents each week, well, if you have the second best team for that week, then you at least get one win. And it sort of does tend to even out schedule imbalances, which often happen. Because you'll have like a 17, 18-week regular season, 12 teams, you can't play everyone twice. What if this team had a million injuries? What if this team stops setting their lineup? Who plays them more than anyone else? The more matchups you have, the less randomness there is, the more fairness there is in a league. Again, not really sure there's a lot of debate there, but people can have issues with it without any question whatsoever. What about your playoffs? Now, this obviously does not apply to roto leagues. This is for head-to-head categories and head-to-head points. How many teams make your playoffs? The more teams that make the playoffs, the more competitive your regular season is. If you have a 12-team league and 4 teams make the playoffs, then teams get eliminated from playoff contention early. They stop caring, as is human nature. They stop making moves. It imbalances the schedule further. That happens. Now, there's obviously a balance. You're not going to say all 12 teams make the playoffs. Or maybe you will. But the more teams that you have making the playoffs, the more competitive your regular season is, the more that everyone is paying attention longer into the regular season. 6 out of 12 is a nice sweet spot. I actually have no problem with 8 out of 12 making it. Again, it just makes that regular season more competitive, evening out the fairness. What dates do you do it? If you're running a 3-week playoff, you run from March the 2nd to March the 23rd. That's my recommended dates. If you're running a 4-week playoff, you run February 23rd to March 23rd. The All-Star game is February the 16th. So, yes, that does include that weird little half week, and that February 23rd can be extended to include all of the All-Star break period. So that extended week. So I've got February 23rd, but you can just include it to have all of the All-Star period. Actually, that's my bad, sorry. February 23rd is the week starting after the All-Star break period. So my bad. Ignore that part. February 23rd through to March 23rd is 4 weeks. What structure do you have? Do you have buys? Now, there are people who adamantly believe in buys. My thing with buys is that is great. It does give you that reward, and it means there's one less matchup you have to win, and it gives you the incentive to finish top 2. It doesn't prevent injuries or ruining your team. It doesn't, because your guys don't actually get a real-life rest over that week. But what it does mean is there are fewer matchups for you to win. Doesn't always mean that it's the right thing. Doesn't mean that it actually guarantees you moving any further. But people do seem to like that idea. The other thing is, do you have a consolation bracket? And my answer to that was there is zero need for that. The only reason you have a consolation bracket is twofold. Is that you are in a group of mates with a league that recurs every year, and you've made determinations of the winner of the consolation pool gets money. They get differences in their draft pick the year before. If you come last in the consolation pick, you have to pay whatever it is. As a general rule, though, there is no need for a consolation bracket. And if there is no consolation bracket with anything on the line, then those teams should not be allowed to make waiver moves, is my very, very strict rule. If that consolation bracket has something, a prize on the end of it, whether that is benefit of draft pick the year after, but in a Dynasty league, whether you're determining draft order, that's all important too. Whether you're talking about getting additional money from winning the consolation prize, then if that is your rule and that's how you set it up, totally cool for those teams to make moves. If the consolation prize is just because, we just want to keep playing fantasy, those teams should not make waiver moves. They are out. They are not part of the league anymore. The playoffs are going on. They're doing whatever they want to do, but they should not be, in my opinion, making waiver moves. That is just an idea or a thought and a principle that I have on leagues. That is how that goes. You might be saying, why not? They're still competing. They're not. That is the idea. When you do not make playoffs in a league, you are done. You are out. You can run that as a little fun thing if you want, but in any sport in the world, once you do not make playoffs, you are out. So you should not be making waiver moves, is my, again, very, very strongly held opinion on how to run those sort of things. Today's episode is also brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Soon, the summer is going to be over, but for now, we're still waiting for a bunch of sports to restart. The Olympics are on, NFL preseason's kicking off, but hockey, basketball, they're not happening. Major League Baseball is, but FanDuel's got something for you because they know that there's just not as many sports going on. So they're going to give every customer, not new customers, every customer, something good. Every single day, all through the summer, you guys are going to get either a boost or a bonus every day. So go to FanDuel.com right now and make the most out of your summer. FanDuel is also an official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. And don't forget to gamble responsibly. Okay, so we talked about the playoffs. I didn't really mention the structure part of it, and what that basically means is that's determining how many teams do you have, and that's about having buys. 1 and 2 get a bye, 3v6, 4v5. Some people have asked the question, do you reseed the playoffs so that whoever the top-ranked team is will always play the bottom-ranked team, or do you just keep it like a standard bracket format? I will always just go with a bracket format, but that's just something that I do. There's no real reason for that. If you want to reseed each week in playoffs, go for it. So that the top team always gets that advantage of playing the bottom team. Totally reasonable to do it that way. Because what you can have is situations, let's say it's 1 through 6, and then 3v6, 4v5. Well, if 6 beats 3, that means that the second team gets to play the 6th team, and the first team theoretically plays the 4th team, so second gets an advantage. I do understand that part of it, but that's also just how stuff happens. But if you wanted to do it and you wanted to reseed, then 1 would play 6, 2 would play 4, and 1 still gets the advantage. Totally okay to do that. You've got to decide these things, though, before you start the season. And that's the same with basically any of these rules. What What about setting up your rosters? The default on Yahoo is 12 teams, 13-man rosters, 156 players rostered. I say here 150 is the bare minimum. There are 540 players rostered in the NBA, or 540 player roster slots in the NBA. 150 is the bare minimum. So if you don't have 11 mates for a 12-team league and you're having a 10-man league or an 8-man league, you need to increase the roster size. Having a league where 100 players are rostered means there are just too many good players sitting on the waiver wire, and then the league turns into luck, and it turns into who is churning the waiver wire the most. I actually think 150 is probably too low. I think we should be looking at 180 as bare minimum. 150 is every starter. That's all it is. It doesn't include any sixth men, seventh men, any ability to stash or hold or any of that sort of stuff. So even though I say 150 bare minimum, I honestly don't. I think you need to look at 180 bare minimum of rosters. How do you determine position eligibility? Do you go, well, sites have their own position eligibility weirdness, but you do go narrow, meaning your spots are point guards, shooting guards, small forwards, which I think leads to problems because A, NBA doesn't really run that way anymore. And B, then you're, again, introducing an extra factor of someone external to your league determining how these players are positioned, and that can cause problems. I think going broader is better. If you want to go all positionless, go for it. I think a good medium is saying guard, forward versus point guard, shooting guard. To me, the ideal roster plan, and this is only possible on Fantrax, but this is what I used last year in Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl. I think it worked really well. We had 3 guards, we had 3 forwards, and a center. We then had a guard/center flex. We had a forward/center. Then we had a full flex/utility. And then we had extended benches. Now, I firmly believe in extended benches for numerous reasons. I think that having those... We'll get to the extended bench in a second. But my ideal roster is 3 guards, 3 forwards, center, guard center, forward center, and then utility. It enables a large range of different ways to build a squad while having some level of barrier on there. Default leagues, Yahoo and ESPN, there are many problems with the way those leagues are set up. And if you are commissioning a league, you need to very least make these changes. There is zero reason why Yahoo has 2 centers as a default. It is an insane setting that makes no sense whatsoever. None. There is zero reason for 2 centers. The easy switch is 1 center out and extra utility spot in. There is no reason why center, the most devalued and most replacement level position in the NBA, should be the one that you require more players for in fantasy. It is absolutely ridiculous. And that's reflected in the fact that Yahoo goes, you must have 2 centers. And ESPN goes, please, you can't have too many centers. Because they have a limit by default for no other position where you can only have 4 center eligible players. And that comes into a problem. Is a player listed center power forward because they're considered center? Are they listed power forward center? Well, they're not considered a center. You just don't need either of those settings. These settings came in back 20 years ago, 30 years ago when a lot of these fantasy platforms started out, where there were situations where centers completely ruled the NBA. There were so many good ones, Yahoo meaning you need 2, or even ESPN saying, hey, they're too good, you can only have 4. Both of those settings just need to get in the bin. Get rid of them completely. They're not required. The other thing is active versus bench. At the moment, 10 starters, 3 bench players, that's not a bench. With the way an NBA fantasy season works, which nearly all of them are daily transaction leagues, that is 13 active spots because you use every game that your bench player plays, meaning you get into larger difficulties when someone gets hurt. It gives you no ability to do handcuffing. It gives you no ability to do player stashing. A 10-3 active versus bench split is not good enough. It's just not good enough. It's wrong, and you should look to change that. So when I talk about expanding your rosters out to 180 minimum, you can still have 10 starters, but give 5 bench, give 7 bench. So that you actually have a bench where those guys who are on your bench, you don't need to play them. There's just no need to play them. You can stash players. You can hold an extra injured guy there. It's not that, 10 versus 3 means you've got 13 active slots. Injured reserve. Yahoo default leagues to IL. Insane. IL should not exist. You have to wait for rules which they put out, which they enforce arbitrarily. Well, it's actually, is it 3 games missed? No, the actual rule that Yahoo puts out there is a player has to be out for or ruled out for in advance 7 days. But even then, like, when do they do it? Do they do it before game lock? Do they do it after game lock? Does it benefit one guy over another one? IL Plus, you go, well, there's an extra glitch there that if someone's listed questionable, you can go ahead in your roster, put them in IL slot and get an extra games played. Well, there are easy ways to curb that by transactional limits, meaning you just can't do that. Right? That is not an issue to me whatsoever. There are easy ways to deal with that. And again, leans back into that system of like having a 10 starter, 3 bench situation means that they're all active players anyway. You've got to have a larger bench. So don't use IL, use IL Plus. I would do a minimum of 3 injured spots, IL Plus spots. The reason I have so many of them, leagues that say we don't want injured slots, we want more waiver churn, ridiculous. Because all that does is create more imbalance in the league, and it means there's less competitiveness in the league, means that teams stop paying attention earlier, meaning you get to unbalanced schedules and you get to the top teams are the only ones who are competing because the only teams who then can afford to stash injured players are the ones that are at the top of the standings. And the guys in the bottom have to drop their good players to try and get games played in, and they lose those guys. The better teams, the good gets good, the worse gets worse. It's pointless. You need to have IL slots. And again, there is zero argument against that. You can drop those arguments in the comments. I'll read them. I'll tell you you're wrong, but you can put those comments down there if you want. You should be having at least 3 IL plus. Now, in Roto, different story. Because your bench in a Roto league does serve as an injured slot. If you wanted to, you don't even need an injured slot in Roto because that's what your bench is for. Just extend your bench out. You don't need it. Either way, whatever we want to do works there with that one. Competitive limits. I think these are vital. You've got to have some sort of limits. In Roto, it is well established that there is a games cap. The default is 82 games per active position. That is the default. You make a decision, is this guy worth using in a games cap? That is default. In head-to-head, for some reason, we have just never done that. But we should. And there are 3 ways of limiting in head-to-head. I think a head-to-head raw dog league where you can just play as many guys as many times as you want is a crazy way to go about it. We want this game, this hobby, to include everybody. People with families, people with jobs, single people with nothing better to do. Good for you. You want to include everybody. You don't want to be, well, I grind the hardest and I'm on my phone on the waiver wire 24 hours a day, so I deserve to win. Like, cool, but that just limits the playing pool. And that's pointless. We need limits. The one that I love and I did last year in Locked On Fantasy Basketball Bowl is the positional cap. It's Roto for head-to-head. Each week, each position has 4 games that you can play. So for the guard slot, you can only play 4 games in that slot, meaning that your team maxes out at 40 games played for the week. You can't go over it. You have 40 games played for the week. That is it. And I think that worked fantastically well. It provided the right balance. It meant that the schedule of, well, my team's got this schedule and I'm streaming these guys. And people go, streaming's a part of the game. It's only a part of the game because of the way the rules have been set up. It doesn't have to be. Or it can be a smaller part of the game. It doesn't have to be. These caps and limits are important, vitally important to creating fairer, broad competitions that do determine the better player and enable the game to grow. You can have a weekly games cap where it's just not per position, but it's like we've got 40 for the week. But as you are well aware that sites have that limit in, and you can't do it on Yahoo for whatever reason. You can on ESPN, but you put it in, I've got my limit is 40, but if you play 39 games on Saturday, then on Sunday you can play as many as you want because they count all of the games on the day where you go over, they all count. Now you can have a commissioner who manually brings it back to sit right at 40, and I think a hard cap is better than a soft cap, but that is a lot more work. The other way that you can do it is with transactional caps. How many waiver moves can you make per week? The default on Yahoo is 4. Some leagues have limits on how many trades you can do. Some leagues have limits on how many waiver moves you can make total for a season. I think that's a silly one, but you can have it. I believe that having a positional cap per week, 40 hard cap for the week, that means you don't need a waiver limit, is the way to go. I think, again, a waiver limit creates a problem if a team has got a bunch of injuries and they had to use 3 waiver moves early in the week to get games played in, and then they cop another injury later in the week, well, that team just gets destroyed and the competitiveness from them is done. They have 2 of those weeks in a row and they tend to lose interest. If you have a games played cap and then you get some injuries, well, you can use as many waiver moves as you want to try and just get extra games in, but you can never go past 40. That is why, to me, that is the perfect ideal setting. Positional, games cap, hard cap for the week. No waiver cap moves. No waiver moves for the season cap. No trade maximums. None of that. The other format which has come in recently is Sleeper. Now, Sleeper continues to shoot themselves in their foot with their fantasy basketball offering. And if Sleeper is watching this, reach out to me again and I'll tell you how wrong you are. They don't offer category leagues. They don't offer any sort of format outside of their format, which they think fixes everything. And I get there is some merit to it. But their setting is that each player can play once per week because they want to just change fantasy basketball to be fantasy football, which it isn't. The NBA is not the NFL. And if the NBA does move to a 2-game per week schedule at some point, it never will. But if it does, and it should, but it never will, then this is more relevant. But that introduces way more luck, way more randomness, and takes out skill. The Sleeper game pick lock-in. Game pick is where you choose what game they play before they play it. Lock-in is after they play the game, you choose to lock in that game for the score for the week. Again, I don't talk about Sleeper because they refuse to listen to the community of fantasy basketball players and offer other options, even though they tend to be somewhat on the right track. And that's frustrating. If you've played Sleeper before, you can argue in the comments below, whatever. But again, there are certain ways that they're somewhat on the right track, but they are way too limiting. And basketball is not a once-a-week sport. It introduces so much more luck into how we're playing, and we don't want it to be luck. We want there to be a level of skill involved, and that is not skill. And choosing which matchup the player is going to play well against is also not skill. There is a ton of randomness in that, and it just doesn't provide the result that we need. One of the other things you're going to need to decide is when do the lineups lock? Do they lock every day? Every week? Twice a week? The default is every day. I think that's the way to go. With weekly leagues, it makes it really tough again. If someone gets injured early in the week, you can't take them out, you're done. Don't like it. Bi-weekly, reduce that slightly, so that's like set your lineup once on Monday, set it again on Thursday. Daily is the way to go. Now, there are 2 ways to do daily as well. Do you do it that you set it before the first game is played and then everything locks? Or do you have it where you can change guys as long as their game hasn't played? That's totally up to you. I don't have really a problem with that. I do think that there is an argument for having it at each game because, again, we have sometimes these weird arbitrary cutoffs where I added a player who's on my bench, but his game was at 9 p.m., but I saw him there and wanted to put him in at 7:30. Oh, no, bad luck, you can't. Again, why do we want to limit people and make sure they're always focused right on this 7 p.m. time, which is dinner time for a lot of people? We do want to expand it so everyone is welcome to play, improving the experience for all players, not the people who grind the absolute hardest at all times. And that might be you, and that might be me, whatever. We still don't need that. We want more we want more people enjoying it. We want everything to grow. So daily, with a lineup lock at the time of the team's game is played, I think is the best way to do that. But again, there'll be disagreements. How do you do transactions? There are really 3 major ways. First come, first served is that FCFS. That means anyone on the waiver wire can be picked up at any point. I think that is silly. Again, that means you have to be active at all points. You have to be watching every game. Someone goes down injured, so you immediately grab their backup. Ha, got him. Okay, but not everyone. To play the game of fantasy basketball, we shouldn't need to be glued in and watching every moment of every single game. Like, that's me generally, but even I don't do that 7 days a week. I have to have a break from stuff. So that's a silly system. Waivers is a mixture of FCFS and a level of priority. Waivers is generally if someone gets dropped, they sit on no one can pick them up for 48 hours, and then it goes in inverse order of standings, and people then highly prioritize their number one waiver claim spot. Again, I don't think people should get dropped and sit on the wire for 2 days. I don't think that's a necessary system whatsoever. But it's better than having first come, first serve. The ideal scenario for me is FAB, free agent auction budget. You were given a budget of money, and every day, the players are available, you can put a bid on them. Having a larger budget, the default's usually 100. It's better to go to 1,000. There's just more spread in the values that you can bid. Because you can't bid $1.50. But if you've got $1,000 budget, you can bid 15. I can bid 16. They can bid 17. Whereas for $100, it's either 1 or 2, right? It just enables more striation of bids. You also should always have $0 bids. You don't want someone to have run out of money. Yes, they should have managed it better, but you don't want someone to run out of money and then be done for the year and can make no moves. Yes, you limit them to only being able to add $0 players, but you always want to have that as an ability. People will argue Fab's stupid because then I can't make a last-minute switch into my team. I do understand that part of it. What we did in Locked On Fantasy Basketball last year, is have 2 Fab processing times. One, which ran in the morning at like 10 a.m. Eastern, and one, which ran 1 hour before the first game of the day. Now, that, again, can only be done on Fantrax. If you wanted the best experience, you play on Fantrax. So I do get that that's not for everybody, but that does give that ability to make your daily claims, and then if something weird happens during the day, and someone is a last minute or a scratch a couple of hours before, you can make that switch. And I think, again, that combined with what we did with the larger benches, the hard positional caps, the no waiver limits was the best experience we could get. But it's not always possible. Some leagues have transaction costs. Every waiver move you make, you pay $1. Every trade you make, you pay $1. That money goes into the pot at the end of the year. If you want to do that, fine. I've never played in a league like that. I don't really think that's necessary. But if that's what you want to do, go for it. But again, I also think that leads to a pay for play, pay to win type scenario, which can limit the competitors, can limit, someone might say, well, I'm out. Why am I going to spend money on making a claim here? I'm never going to come back. And you create the haves and the have-nots, less competitiveness, people dropping out, not as good. Don't like it. If you want to do it, whatever, don't think it's a good idea. Trading in leagues. You know what I'm going to say? You should never, ever, 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 ever have league votes. Never. Oh, but how? That's me. It's my team. I'm going to control if someone else is going to get better. Not your business. Absolutely not your business. You should never have a league vote on a trade ever. Ever. And I will never budge on that. You should never have a league vote. The only system for league trades is a commissioner veto. And the commissioner only vetoes in cases of clear collusion and cheating. So you got to have a league vote, Josh. What if someone trades Giannis for Will Barton? Well, that's where the commissioner comes in and goes, you're cheating. 1 more of these and you're out. You're kicked out. Your team is locked. In fact, a trade like that, you would kick them out immediately. But if someone says, I'm going to trade Jalen Williams for, let's think of a name, Fred VanVleet. And someone goes, nah, man, look at VanVleet. These ranking is 60 and Williams is 30. Numbers that I've made up. Not your business to police that. You don't know how they're building their squad. You don't know what other moves they're making. You don't know how they value players. Stuff can change like that. It is not your business to police how someone makes a trade. What if someone's ripping off someone else? Oh, well, why didn't you rip them off? Again, if it is cheating, the commissioner cuts it out. That is the only thing. Trades go through. Have a commish that can read these things and understand it. Now, if your commissioner is cheating on trades, well, that's a completely different story. That's why you want a trusted commish. But you can't do much about that. You should have a trade deadline. It's at least 1 week before the playoff starts. In Roto, have it like start of March, middle of March. You should have a deadline for trades. No trades in fantasy playoffs. Some leagues do pick trading as well. Whatever. If you want to do pick trading before a draft, that's okay. Don't really have a strong opinion on that either way. That brings us to the draft. The most common form of draft that everyone knows is snake drafting. Why is it a snake? Because it's serpentine. It goes back and forward and up and down like the game on your old Nokia. We all know how that works. That's your standard draft. What is a more common thing that is coming now, and I think we'll see a lot more people trying to do this, again, can't do it on Yahoo and ESPN because they're 20 years behind the times, is third round reversal, meaning the team that picks first in round 2, the team that picked last in round 1 picks first in round 2 and first in round 3. And they go back to last in 4, first in 5, last in 6, etc., etc. We just switch the order in round 3 only. And then from then on, it carries on like a snake draft. What it does is it eliminates some of the early advantage the team picking at the top of round 1 gets. The team that gets Jokic, Wemby, Shea, that means that they get a pick at the end of round 2 and a pick at the end of round 3. That is that benefit. And any league that is over 12 teams, I think that third round reversal is 100% essential. If you go 30 teams, and I don't really think you should ever play 30. I do play a 30-team league. It's really hard to do. There's so much luck involved, and the competitiveness switches really quickly because of how the difference between the guy picking first and 30 is immense. So, you should be, any league that's over 12 absolutely needs third round reversal. In 12s, if you want to do it, I think it's totally reasonable as well. Obviously, we'll get to that in a second. The other thing you need to look at is your pick time. Are you doing a fast draft or a slow draft? I love a slow draft. We incorporate everyone around the world. Yes, you don't have that panic of making a pick, but I think having time to assess what you're doing makes sense. And if you are in a slow draft where the pick is 6 to 7 hours and someone doesn't make a pick, you don't have to have a crack at them. If your draft takes 2 weeks, that's fine. That is what the idea of the draft is. Now, it can be annoying when someone deliberately lets their clock run down all the whole way through, and that is not an ideal scenario. But if someone's just taking some time to make a pick or is not logging in every 5 seconds, totally, that is the reason for these drafts. The fairest way to do a draft is an auction draft, which is also known as a salary cap draft. I'm not going to go through the bait. We'll do a show on auction drafts at some point. This is the fairest. It's the most fun. It's the longest. It probably takes double the time of a snake draft, but it is by far the best way to do it. And if you haven't done it, do it. It's harder. It's longer, but it's better. Again, not really a debate on that. How are you going to determine your prizes? There'll be many leagues that be like, oh, the nonsense at the end of the season means we're just going to pay out the regular season winner. If that's the case, just play Roto. Just play Roto. That's okay. Or if you're going to do that, don't have playoffs at all. We're going to reward the regular season winner, then also reward the playoff winner. If you want to do that, that's okay, and you want to split the prize. I just think if you're going to do that, and there seems to be a lot of people focused on, well, I've been the best all year, so I deserve to win. There's no such thing as deserve. You just win. All right? To me, there's no such thing as deserve. And again, if you think that, if you've been the best team all year and you deserve to win, don't have the playoffs, which is a totally reasonable way to go about it. But that's how it is. If you think that you being on top means you deserve to win, then don't have the playoffs. Is there a penalty for coming in last place? Easier to do in Dynasty and Keeper Leagues or continual managers where they pay an extra fee or they can, if you finish last, they put $50 in and that means they can stay active more during the season. Fine to do it. Can you set up a situation where you get at least, say, your money back if you make the playoffs? That means those teams in 8th or 9th are fighting to get into 6th at the end of the season. Increase competitiveness. Increase how long teams are competitive for. These are all different ways to do that. A couple more that we're going to go through. The scoring systems. I'm actually not going to go too much into this. If you're playing in a points league, you're better off just to keep the default scoring because let me tell you now, there is no such thing as a perfect point scoring system. There is no such thing as a point system which makes it closer to a category league. There is no such thing that turns a points league into a more complex version. There is no such thing in a points league which truly represents real value. It doesn't exist. I think an ESPN points league system is better than a Yahoo points league system, but whatever you're playing, just stick with default. It also makes it almost impossible to compare valuations of players or ask questions if you don't use default. Keep it default. If you're playing in category, the category defaults are outdated. Field goal percentage doesn't tell us anything about a player. Effective field goal percentage is a much better category because it weights the importance of three-pointers in there. Three-pointers made is also an outdated category. It was something that came in back in the 80s when fantasy started, when people were taking 1 3 a game. And if you hit threes, it was a huge bonus. Now, everyone takes them. And what's threes? Well, it's just points. Why do we double count that? But I also don't think there's a very clear, easy option to replace them. You can, but I don't think you have to. It's important to look at what is the real value of a player versus shooting, but also what's the balance in a league. You can take, we did this in a Roto league last year, and replace field goal percentage with effective field goal percentage. I think it worked pretty well, but you also got to consider how does it balance your league out, because we all know that the centers have the big field goal percentage. 3-point shooting guards often have lower field goal percentage. It doesn't reflect their real life value, but it also gives us an extra category for bigs to jump up in. My argument to that would be, why do I want to make bigs more valuable if they're actually less valuable in real life? But that's an argument for that. People will often chuck these categories in as extra categories of category leagues. Double doubles, triple doubles. Terrible categories, should not have them. Number one, they're binaries. You can either get 1 or 0. The pool of players who can get double doubles and triple doubles is finite. You can't just grab a double double guy off the waiver wire. They don't exist. What is a 10 and 10 game better than an 18 and 9 game? No. Why do we reward on the dot of 10s? There's no need for this. It's not a useful category. Field goals made and free throws made. Some people say we won't have free throw percentage, we'll have free throws made. Do you know what a free throw made is? It's a point. You hit a free throw, you get a point. We don't need to double count free throws. You make a field goal, that's a point. Now, I know we've got threes and they do the same thing, and that's why I don't think threes should be included, but they are there as a default thing that's there. But you don't want to add more of that in because that is just all points. I don't think you need to change that. I don't have a perfect setting, but I know that those 4, double-double, triple-double, field goals made, free throws made, are not good categories. Neither are techs, neither are ejections, neither are flagrants. They're not good categories. You should not use them. The last thing I'll talk about here is Dynasty Leagues. I probably do a full show on Dynasty settings, but I want to cover a couple of things off here. If you are playing in a Dynasty League, your rosters need to be deep. 300 players minimum. I had many questions last season, 4 weeks into the season. Hey, I'm in a Dynasty League. Should I go and add Amen Thompson? He seems to be playing. That's not a Dynasty League. A Dynasty League basically should have every viable player rostered. You shouldn't have a 120-man Dynasty League where there's just players floating and you're churning through a waiver. That is not a Dynasty League. That is not how you should run that. You need to determine what your retention penalties are. Can you just keep someone at no cost? Is there a salary associated with a player where it rises each season? You've got to keep under a cap. You determine that. It can work either way, but you need to work those rules out. You need to have a rookie draft, and the rookie draft needs to include rookies. Only players who were eligible for the draft in the NBA should be included. Not random players who came over 3 years later. Not guys who missed their entire rookie season, like Nikola Topic. Like, for example, Nikola Topic is included in this year's rookie drafts, not next season's. But you've got to have a rookie draft somehow. Determine your keeper versus dynasty, which we talked about at the start. How do you eliminate tanking? Have a draft lottery. Flatten draft lottery odds. They're the 2 easy ways to do that. Meaning that if you just set a bad lineup each week, you don't get the number 1 pick. That it's a full lottery, that it's a lottery for 5 teams with flattened odds. Then there's no benefit for tanking in that respect. You could have a situation where you've got to actually have 30 games played for the week or whatever number you want, and if you don't, you lose a lottery ball. That's another way of eliminating or reducing tanking. And the most important thing in a Dynasty League is have a constitution. Have a constitution. And that has to have all the rules set out, plus it needs to have a clause that says any additional or exceptional circumstance is ruled on by the commissioner as he sees fit. And the next part it's got to have is any rule that is brought up to be instituted will have a X year time delay. You can't say at the start of the year, hey, we're just bringing in a new rule this season. In Dynasty Leagues, you can't do that. You say, we're going to have a new rule. It comes in 2026. Prepare yourselves. We're not the AFL, for those guys of you know in Australia what I'm talking about. You can't just chuck a rule in for teams that have planned, and that's the idea of Dynasty, planning in advance. You can't just chuck a rule in that says, hey, everything's different now, and we're actually going to have a penalty on keeping players. You go, what? I didn't plan for that. You can say, we're doing that, and it's coming in 2 years' time. But that's what you need to do. Have that in your constitution. Commissioner will look at exceptional circumstances when they arise, and any rule change can be instituted but will not come into practice for X years. Usually 2 is the good way to do that. And that is the end of the show. If you have any other, and I'm sure I've missed some stuff, if you have any other league setup questions, drop them in the comments. If you disagree with some of these things, that's okay too. There are some that I will not agree with you with, but you can disagree. Drop that in the comments as well. So, go ahead, hit the thumb, tell me what we're different in, tell me if you've got any other questions about setting up a league, and let's get ready to play fantasy. Guys, we are done here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. See ya.